Shikues të ALBUK TV, mirë mrama dhe mirë se vini tek Zeri Diaspores. Për ju sonte kam zonin Maria Bamieh, Ish-Prokurore në Unmik, për të vazhduar pastaj në Eulex, e cila ka qenë përgjegjëse për të marrë me krime trana, krime të luftes dhe korrupsion përgjithësi. Ka ardhur special ekskluzivisht në emisionin ton për të na njoftuar me biografinë e saj në Kosovë, disa lande të cilat ka kaluar dhe mënyrën e qasjes dhe më në fund se në çfarë forme e gjet veten tek Eulexi si punëtore në rrethin e tyne, të Unmikut. Më vonë ndoshta do të shqyrtojmë edhe çështjen e Gjykates Speciale, e cila është special për ish luftarët e ushtrisë lirimtare të Kosoves, special për shqiptarët që ka një herë shifet si jo edhe fair edhe normal. Zonja Bamieh, mirë se erdhe. Ms. Bamieh, good evening and thanks for joining us in our special program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. To start with, we have in the coronavirus now everywhere spread. How are you dealing with it? How are you surviving?
Well, it's hard. It's hard for everybody, and we just have to follow the rules, stay at home, keep distance, and pray we don't get affected.
Let's hope so, and I hope we have a decent distance here between us to make sure that we not kind of transmit any kind of virus or anything. And to help NHS, which have done a great job, to be honest.
Absolutely.
And I got to say, I'm not sure how much you follow Kosovo now, but in Kosovo, the health minister and the doctors and staff in general have done a fantastic job. I'm so proud of them.
And I've heard also that the rules there now are very strict. A lot more strict than we have in England about going out, and can only do it within certain times, and which I think is great. It's great that a small country like that is reacting so well to what is an awful virus.
What makes me proud the most was that not just the kind of government of Kosovo, how requested from the people how to respond to what's happening, but the people itself kind of in very mature way, which kind of we learn to say the Western world is very, very much ahead of with everything ahead of us, when we find out that actually the people of Kosovo have respected greatly. And if I go back to victims, I think we are in very much of the minimal victims that
I know that's excellent news, and I think that is because they took action promptly, closed their borders promptly, and learned a lot from what was happening outside, and reacted quickly, and that was vital to keeping the numbers down.
Well, let's hope we're going to keep safe, and we will have a time in our life to actually come back to a freedom again.
Oh, yes.
During 1906, you were invited, you applied for a job to go to work for Unmik in Kosovo.
Yeah, in 2006, I made an application to work in Kosovo for the UN. I was a prosecutor in London, and I'm again a prosecutor in London. But at the time, the cases were repetitive, the names changed, the arguments were the same, and I wanted to get the wider experience of dealing with the kinds of crimes that never happen here and that we never see, and that was my motivation. I've always been interested in international affairs anyway, and I wanted to contribute something to international justice.
Looking back now, do you think you're satisfied that to the best of your ability you have done a great job there? For what Kosovars, Albanians, including Serbs, in fact, from time to time they felt they were left out, whether it was from Unmik, Eulex, or any organization they were there. At some point, there was impression that there was a feeling that things are not going
No.
in a good direction.
Yes. And I think that happens anywhere when an administration is imposed on a country and they're not able to elect and choose their laws. That naturally is something that people rebel against after a while. And that happens the world over. And Unmik was there for quite a long time. They were administrating Kosovo. The Kosovan people didn't have the voice that they needed to move forward, and hence they got frustrated with the lack of progress that they saw with Unmik. But I don't think that frustration was quite justified. It was a natural reaction of lack of freedom to make of self-determination. And wherever people are not able to determine their own futures and they see mistakes happening, and then they rebel against it. It's natural.
Did you find because when Unmik took over Kosovo after the war, Kosovo was kind of in really difficult state. Did you find at any time that you're dealing with the professionals from the side of Kosovans, including Albanians and Serbs? Did you ever feel that there was a professional people there, they were excluded just because they were not part of Unmik? Or did they manage, the administration, did they manage to include them, to have their input, if I put it that way? Because normally local people help quite loads if they know how to help.
Yeah, I think, well, within Unmik, there were a lot of Kosovan people working, but in terms of the interaction between the high officials in Kosovo and the high officials within Unmik, I know that there was liaison, but the extent and how effective that liaison was, I was not a party, I was just a humble prosecutor. I didn't
have your own,
to be able to determine the effectiveness or not of that higher liaison and working in partnership with the country. It was difficult for me as a simple prosecutor trying to do a job, because if you prosecuted an Albanian, you were considered to be biased against Albanians. And if you prosecuted a Serb, I recall once I prosecuted and convicted a Serb of ethnic hatred during the war. He had come back to Kosovo and I had him arrested. And the whole issue blew up into one of bias.
Was that Marko Sivanovic?
No, I don't. That was a different one. This was...
we don't have to go by name.
Yeah, this was a case where somebody was alleged to have committed some pretty awful atrocities, and it ended up getting raised in the Security Council, how Unmik were interfering with the right to return of Serbians. And all it was a simple prosecutor arresting somebody for war crimes, you know, and that was the dangerous political environment and the political blowback that could happen at any time when you're just doing a job based on the papers, based on the evidence.
So because of the euphoria of the people, they did not consider the facts. They only kind of...
Yeah, they looked to see...
what nationality is and given an opinion.
Yeah, and I prosecuted people of both nationalities for various offences. And I think it was my British training as a barrister. You look at the papers, you look at the evidence, you assess the evidence, you determine how credible it is, whether it's admissible, and then you proceed.
How the Unmik administration helped in the cases? Not necessarily help to resolve the case, but help with the tools and people that you need around to actually conduct fairly the case?
It was difficult, to say the least. We didn't have proper identification facilities at the police stations. We didn't have the forensic teams that we needed, that we have access to here. We didn't get the cooperation of K4, because K4 were there at the height of the difficulties, and for a lot of the offences and crimes that we were asked to investigate, the initial evidence was now in intelligence files located somewhere in K4, and we could never gain access to them. So that must have increased the frustration of victims and witnesses, because they thought we weren't prosecuting cases that they felt ought to be prosecuted, and sometimes it was just that we didn't get the cooperation from other bodies, from a third party, which we needed. In terms of forensics, we would send forensic evidence abroad to get it dealt with. That often took a long time for that to come back. And over here we have digital identification suites and photographic identifications. When I went in 2007, I was still setting that up with the police. It hadn't already
happened there.
Happened
it was
there.
Something that need to go with it.
That we needed to set up and deal with. And also there were other difficulties trying to do that job, because you had parallel courts in the north.
What was your cooperation with a parallel court in the north?
Initially, initially,
north of Mitrovica.
Yeah, initially I was dealing, when I was in Unmik, with one war crimes case involving international judges, involving a Serbian defendant, and that case took place in the court in North Mitrovica. He was successfully prosecuted, but on appeal he got off. And it was working. It was an operational court. It wasn't a parallel court. It was part of
the main court.
The main court system. And then there were the riots in 2008, and the courthouse was taken over by snipers, and there were lots of political unrest in the north, and Eulex took over, and that was the first court I was assigned to.
Eulex?
To North Mitrovica,
North Mitrovica, right.
When I worked for Eulex. And whatever you say about Unmik, Unmik had plans and was trying to achieve its mandate. When I went to North Mitrovica, there were no plans.
How did you switch from Unmik to Eulex?
I didn't find the switch very difficult because I'd been prosecuting cases within Eulex, and my job
Within Unmik.
Within Unmik, and my job in Eulex was the same, essentially. But I found the transition.
Was any case being carried from the period of Unmik to the period of Eulex?
Yes. A number of cases were carried through. Clinton bombing was one, triple murder was another case that was carried over. I think there were some cases involving Zabrazaku that were carried over. There were numerous cases that were carried over. Everything.
Jabir Jarko.
Yeah.
The mayor of Kaçanik,
Yeah. I don't know all the cases, I only know the ones that I dealt with. And the courthouse in the north was not working at all. It was a mess. All the papers had been strewn everywhere. We didn't know who was in custody, who was not in custody. And we had to start with the help of the prosecutors in South Mitrovica. The local prosecutors came in and we put case lists together, discovered...
Those prosecutors were Albanian mixed, Serbians,
Albanian,
or mixed?
Albanian. But we had to find out what cases
were there
and who was in custody, and get papers and start dealing with them, because they'd been in custody for a while without anyone prosecuting them because of the troubles. However, I mean, some of them were in custody for cases that they should not even have been prosecuted for, because there was absolutely no evidence against them. And others were quite rightly there, and we started to sift through the cases and deal with it. But the first thing I noticed was the total lack of planning. There was no plan for the North Mitrovica by the EU. There was no short-term plan or long-term plan. And I recall asking about this, and they were scurrying around trying to put a plan together, which I found unprofessional. And it wasn't only that.
Just to ask you a simple question. During the time that they kind of took over the cases from Unmik into Eulex, they did not take the files from Unmik of how far did they go, so they can continue or can update them?
Well, some of the files were
disappeared.
Were not Unmik files. Some of the files were ordinary files from the court in Mitrovica. Some of them were international serious crimes, but the majority of them were not. And although we might have had files, the court has to have their files and their records
for each case.
And the court didn't have those. And we had to have an inventory team, and we put the whole shebang together from scratch, basically. And then we started to prosecute cases. The parallel courts refused to recognize Eulex and our authority.
A parallel court was the court run by Serbians.
Yeah. And they were instructing everybody not to cooperate with us. And I recall visiting many police stations in the north, trying to gain cooperation. And I think we started to succeed to gain cooperation. And we were trying to get, you see, you can't prosecute a people unless you reflect their ethnic makeup. So you couldn't have started the court in Albania with just Albanian judges, because you wouldn't get the authority and you wouldn't get the buy-in by the local people who were majority Serbian. So you needed to have a mixture of Serbian and Albanian judges to make it effective. And while the parallel systems were not cooperating, we, as prosecutors and the international judges there, we started to hold events and functions where we invited Serbian and Albanian judges and Serbian and Albanian prosecutors to various gatherings and meetings and lunches. And that helped to break down some barriers, and we were starting to, you know, these things happen chip by chip, inch by inch, to break down those barriers. I don't know what's happening there now. I haven't kept up.
In Mitrovica and Kosovo, there is a communication going. The Kosovo Court of Justice have more or less control over the North Mitrovica, as well as the police forces.
Right.
Are so it's
because they had mixed groups with the municipalities, didn't
yes,
they? Yeah,
they're well mixed so far.
Well, I mean, I think that's progress. It's progress from what was
from
there
where
when
you got it.
From where I got it.
There was a few cases, that very important cases that you dealt with during that period of time that you're a prosecutor. What cases do you think you were involved mostly, and you think that you have done, you succeeded on prosecuting the high crimes, corruption or war crimes?
Well, there was a number of them. Some, although I was successful, I was disappointed with the results. It was Clinton bombing.
Clinton bombing was in a restaurant, the bombing restaurant in Clinton Boulevard.
In Bill Clinton Avenue. It was basically a feud between police officers and a man called Sekiracha, and it was involved a famous singer in Kosovo, Adelina Ismail, and her family, and it led to a death of a police officer.
Triumfriza,
yeah,
was called.
And the police sought to seek revenge for that because they didn't feel justice was being served, and decided to bomb his restaurant. And they placed the bomb in such a position that instead of going upwards to his restaurant, it spread. And I think 3 people died and 11 people had life-changing injuries, plus a whole lot more with minor injuries. It was a horrific incident.
You grouped that into the Clinton 1 and Clinton 2, yes. To what I followed. There was a signs of interference of high level of Eulex into the case in certain ways.
That was the first time that I ever had a hint that there may be bribes going on, and I didn't have that experience in my life before as a prosecutor in the CPS. There'd been a few dodgy things where people had been dismissed, but nothing like
that
level of bribing judges. And it was a newspaper article that had come out in the middle of the trial, and I didn't believe it. I just thought it was nonsense, and I just put it to one side and carried on doing my case, you know, thinking it was a whole load of nonsense. It subsequently transpired that there was some suspicions, valid suspicions about the processes in that case. In any event, I prosecuted it, and 2 of the 3 defendants were convicted. And then they came back to me and told me, at least one of them came back and told me who else had been involved, because we all knew there were 2 cars with about 8 police officers in there. I tried to prosecute Clinton too, but by then the role of the judge in that case, Francesco Floret, became public knowledge because the witnesses stated in open court that they had paid bribes to Mr. Floret for an acquittal in that case, and he wanted more money, and he only acquitted 1 person as opposed to all 3.
The amount of money was mentioned around 250 to 300,000.
It was mentioned 300,000, and there was allegedly a meeting in Albania where money was transferred.
Into the Francesco Florence.
Allegedly handed to Mr. Floret. Now, these are suspicions. There's evidence, some evidence to substantiate them, but they're not proof beyond all reasonable doubt. But they are things that an organization acting rationally and promptly should properly investigate to see whether there is any truth or not behind the allegations. And that never happened. Not in my time in Eulex. And anyway, as I said at the time, even I didn't believe it.
What kind of body suppose or should have investigate this thoroughly? This allegation to say, or whatever facts were there?
Well,
apart from the elite there already being.
Well, the brother of one of the defendants in the case did write to Miss Novotna and state about the fact that he...
Yaroslava Novotna, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is, I didn't know anything about that until afterwards. And she basically said that...
the brother of... it was Besnik Hassan, wasn't it?
No, it was a brother of Shpend Karimi, Ilir Karimi, who wrote the letter. I think I've got a copy here. And she basically wrote back and said that there would be no investigation. Which obviously, when people don't have recourse to appeals and other avenues, it leads to frustration. And at that time, I knew nothing about this letter. And as I said to you, I didn't believe the allegations initially of bribes taking place. And I carried on with my work. And then I ended up dealing with the Tolai case.
Yeah, as a corruption case.
Yes, and in the course of that case, we were intercepting Mr. Tolai's phones, but we weren't getting any information because he knew we were intercepting his phones.
Right.
But then I found out that he had other phones that he was using in prison. And I managed to get those numbers and intercept those phones. And from those phone calls, there was clear evidence that he was meeting with intermediaries and trying to, although they never discussed actual money changing hands, the conversation was, speak to this man if he can guarantee my release, only if he can guarantee it, then see what we can do for him. Now,
did they mention the man by name, or?
Yes, Flory. They kept calling him Flory.
So Francesco Flori's name came up again.
Again,
as
a lot of times.
In very much a different case, I'd say.
A totally different case. And Novotna's name was mentioned as well, because Flory quite rightly said, I can't get involved at this stage because she's a really difficult prosecutor, but I'll speak to her boss.
Said to?
To the intermediary.
Intermediate between the Florent and?
Florent said to the intermediary, and I am listening to the intermediary telling Tolai that he's going to get involved, but he can't directly get involved because it's not like the English system. Cases are divided into investigation, and then after the indictment, the judges can be involved. But prior to that, it was my decisions all the way. But what he was doing, because he couldn't get involved directly over me, he was going to speak to Novotna, who was my boss.
Yurislava Novotka.
Yeah. To get me off the case and give the case to one of his Italian colleagues.
Did you recall the Italian colleague? Or
yeah, Maurizio Silvestro. That was the only Italian colleague I had.
So Francesco preferred to have in case Maurizio rather than you?
Well, he didn't prefer anything. He was hoping to get Maurizio involved to help Tolai.
Right.
And I know it was Maurizio that was the Italian they were referring to. We only had one Italian prosecutor. We had many Italians working in our office, but only one Italian prosecutor at that time, who was male, who had dogs. And there were conversations about meetings that took place with the Italian prosecutor and the dogs, and it got very detailed. And I actually asked Maurizio, I said, are you involved in this? And do you know this person? And he denied all knowledge. But I know that that person, the intermediary, had called our office. I also know that intermediary was the intermediary that was meeting with Florent on a number of occasions, which he's admitted to on national television anyway. So those things needed investigation. but never got.
In the end, was the case successfully kind of dealt with, or there was a difficulties to get to the end of it?
Yes, well, I think Clinton bombing too. I think they were terrified what the witnesses might say next about the bribes in Florida. So that case was dismissed and died. In relation to Tolai, there were ongoing appeals, and then the SPRK closed down, so they couldn't dismiss the cases, and it was taken over, luckily, by a very good local prosecutor, who then pursued and took off where I'd left off, and he's recently had all his appeals rejected and is currently serving a sentence
in
Kosovo.
The sentence served in someone who replaced you from Kosovo local.
Finished it off.
Right. It said, how difficult did you find it as a prosecutor? But you're supposed to actually have peace of mind and do the investigation, hold the team helping you to put together. In this case, that actually the whole team were trying to actually create difficulties for you to...
Well, what happened after Florida had spoken to Novotna, the whole thing became explosive. I made internal reports, and instead of acting on those internal reports, Novotna turned on me. I found myself, everything I was doing was being obstructed. If I asked for resources, for example, I'd need police officers to investigate something, I wouldn't get them. I was marginalized and not, before I was acting in the place of my boss, and thereafter those opportunities didn't arise anymore. I had my car taken away. I was moved into the tiniest little office with 3 other people. So the changes that happened after I made my complaint were fairly dramatic.
They start restricting you, isolating you in a way.
Absolutely. The most disappointing thing was the total lack of support that I got from the embassy. Total lack of support.
From our British embassy here.
From the British embassy in Kosovo. And this saga carries on because after I complained, the papers were lost or disappeared, whatever you want to say. I have all these things happening to me, and then I am having to apply for my own job again, and Novotna is on the panel. So I complained, hold on a minute, how can she be on the panel? I made a complaint about her. And
Would that be seen as a conflict of interest?
Well, precisely. It's wholly wrong. And so then I raised the complaint all over again, and they can't find the papers, and I complained several times to my national contingent leader and to the British embassy, and here in London to the Foreign Office, because I never dreamt that the British government would let them get away with such conduct. It was against everything. Maybe I was naive, I don't know, but I thought that these embassies were there to look after our interests overseas, but obviously not. Whereas the Italians, on the other hand, when after I'd complained, they suddenly started an investigation into Florida, and I was working with the head of intelligence, Mike Rawlinson, and I handed him over all my evidence in relation to, not in relation to Tolai. I mean, Tolai jumps up and down. He thinks I've got something against him. I was just doing my job in relation to him.
Like normal prosecutor would
Like
do
normal
anyway.
prosecutor. But the thing I was really angry about was what was happening inside of Eulex with Florit and Yaroslava Novotna, with the complaints I'd made that just disappeared. Anyway, luckily, we had a Scandinavian head of legal, and he found and a Scandinavian. There was head of legal who found the whole situation with the papers going missing highly suspicious.
Within the Eulex.
Within Eulex, because they'd searched for my initial complaint, they couldn't find it. They looked for the papers and they found some papers, but not everything, in the file of the previous head of mission. So they knew I'd made a complaint. So they decided to look into it, and a special team was recruited, Heike Wendorf. They started the ghost team to investigate Florit and others who were involved. Now, at the time, I didn't know that they were looking into Maurizio and another police officer as well. So, the Italian ambassador, Giffoni, at the time.
He was ambassador in Kosovo?
Yeah. Jumps up and down. 3 of our Italians are under investigation. This is unacceptable. Goes to see the head of mission.
So basically, from some kind of real investigation went into political?
Yeah. Anyway, then I get thrown out. The guy who's the head of executive is then criticized for not controlling me. He is then criticized for holding an investigation into Flora and the Italians, even though he had kept everybody in Brussels informed about it. They denied they were informed. And
when you say everybody in Brussels, who was in Brussels that was directly responsible for the Eulex behavior in Kosovo?
First, it was Hans-Hulk Haber, who was aware of the investigation and agreed to allow that to investigate.
And what was his responsibility within the European Union?
He was the civilian commander in the Kosovo desk in Brussels.
Right.
And then it changed, and I can't remember who it went to, but it changed, and the head of executive was being obstructed and politically interfered with to an enormous degree. And so I'm pushed out. The head of legal, the Scandinavian guy, is pushed out. Mats Mattisson, who was the head of executive, is pushed out.
He was pushed out by
Mucci, Gabriele Mucci, the head, the Italian head, who took over.
In Kosovo or
in Kosovo? Europe? In Kosovo, he was head of Eulex,
and
appointed by Mogherini. He came in with the idea that 3 of my fellow Italians, and he'd been speaking to Giffoni, the Italian ambassador as well, are suffering discrimination because they're all being investigated unfairly, blah, blah, blah. And he comes in, gets rid of me, pushes the head of legal out, pushes Mats Mattisson out. Heike Wendoff, who was a prosecutor who was investigating Floret, had decided to also investigate Yaroslava Novotna, and he was looking into the other two guys, Maurizio and the third suspect, who was a police officer. He's dismissed. They walk into the office on the same day. Miucci sends an Italian prosecutor with the Carabinieri. They go into Heike's office, who's conducting all the investigation, take all his papers. They tell the staff not to touch it. And this was done with the knowledge of your chief prosecutor, chief local prosecutor, and they said, this was the excuse, we are going to investigate this in a joint investigation team under the by SPRK, and oh gosh, I've forgotten his name. He was the anyway, they were going to investigate the case. They didn't want Heike investigating it. They wanted to keep it within SPRK. The only problem is that Yaroslava Novotna was in charge of SPRK. So how could that be an independent investigation?
So again, someone was there to actually make sure that the investigation were supervised
and cleaned up, so that there was no blowback on the EU and Eulex. But it got worse than that, because the same day as they went into the independent investigators to Heike's office, they had also, by now I had left, they had already suspended the head of intelligence for allegedly being critical of their investigator who was investigating me, Jean-Paul Jacques. Yeah? And he made some comment about Jean-Paul Jacques, and for that he was suspended. And then he suddenly gets a mysterious airborne infection. No, he was suspended. The Swedish government, unlike the British government or the Italian government, jumped up.
They made sure they get involved to support.
They got involved to support Mike Rawlinson.
They're experts, I would rather say.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike Rawlinson was then reinstated, yeah? And then he gets this mysterious airborne infection, waterborne infection, and he has flown home to Sweden. While he's home in Sweden, these two raids happen, the one on Heike's office, and they do a raid on the office of the head of intelligence. Now, we're not talking about raids on criminals within Kosovo. We're talking about departments within their own offices, their own staff they're doing these raids on. They never did one on Francesco Floret. They never raided Yaroslava's Novotna's office when I raised the problems. But here they are raiding the head of intelligence's office. And not only did they raid his office and take all the papers from his office, they wanted to get into his safe. What was in his safe? All the Tolai tapes, all the transcripts of the interceptions which involved the Eulex investigation. And I have the evidence of people who were standing there, who when they called a local guy, they couldn't get into his safe, to burn open his safe and I have the photograph of that. They burnt open his safe, they took the tow-lie tapes, and I don't know what else they took. But thereafter, there was a complaint from the staff in the intelligence unit because they didn't just cover Eulex intelligence, they covered European intelligence, and they worked closely with K4. And there was a lot of confidential and highly sensitive stuff in that office. At which point, Miucci, the head of Eulex, had to capitulate and return the evidence. But they took 15 of those tapes that I had given to Mike Rawlinson, and only 12 were ever returned. So there were 3 tapes missing, and I've got evidence of that too, because witnesses were there, and these are now my witnesses. In any event, poor Mike, who was our last man standing, who was involved in this investigation, is now in Sweden, and he was ex-army, a very, very honourable man. He would never speak to the media, he would never speak to the press. He held his principles very honourably. And he tried within the system, he was very, very sick, to do something, and there was an investigation team sent from Sweden as a result of what happened to him and his office being raided. And this team were being asked by Federica Mogherini to endorse Miucci's reappointment for another year. The Swedes refused. They were appalled by the way he had behaved, and they wanted an investigation on how their staff member, Mike Rawlinson, had been treated. The British never asked for any such thing for me, but there you have it. If they don't help their people when they're out in disasters or stuck out in the middle of nowhere during the coronavirus, what hope is there for their staff working abroad? In any event, this investigation...
Mogherini got involved directly into the head of the Eulex,
yeah,
and the way the Eulex should function and get organized there.
Absolutely, yeah. So
was that allowed to do it? To appoint someone to that level, or to support someone, or to actually filter into that kind of system?
Well, that's the way I think the EU operate. It's very secret, it's very clandestine. When one person gets appointed, they appoint all their friends. She and Miucci knew each other. She gets appointed, Miucci gets appointed, she supports him, irrespective of what he's done or is doing, or is trying to hide. That's the way it works.
When I listen to those kind of stories that you kind of explain quite clearly, it sounds like there was a kind of movie that it could be imagined, but never in real life would these kind of things happen. Especially Eulex, that people of Kosovo have rely on them and thinking that finally by bringing Eulex in Kosovo is going to help us to see the light through the rule and law.
This is why, when I think about the comparison between Eulex and Unmik, I know the people of Kosovo were disappointed with both of them, I know that. But Unmik was part of a large organization used to having international missions to administer countries' post-war conflict.
So they had a bit of experience as organization.
As an organization. As an organization, they have proper internal investigation system. They have loads of standard operating procedures which cover whistleblowing, staff treatment, staff rights, how the staff are supposed to behave with in the countries that they're operating.
Knowing their culture, their kind of
Absolutely.
interacting with.
They had sufficient equipment like pens, paper and translators. I mean, they had a planning team before they set up Eulex. When we started, we didn't have enough translators. We didn't have basic things like pens and paper to write on. I don't know what they planned for, but it wasn't for what the reality was.
To what I heard also, that the Unmik was, Eulex was created by European countries' members donating people.
Yeah, I was a donation.
How one organization can get organized by having countries individually donating people rather than the people being screened, whether they are professionally fit for purpose or...
Well, we were screened. We were screened
by your own country, or was a main body that actually...
I was screened both by my own country, and then I was screened by Eulex, because I had to go for an interview with Eulex, and I had to pass that interview.
And that head that has interviewed groups that are coming from different countries, who was the head appointed by?
For the first interview,
I'm just trying to picture the pyramid of the organization.
Okay.
How that came about, because to me it sounds like a combination of something that no one knows what they're doing the others.
All right, yeah. When we first started, there were a number of interview teams set up within Eulex. So the countries put forward their people, and the Eulex team members interviewed those people and decided, I want this one, I don't want that one, for whatever reason, according to what their needs were. So I had two screenings, one by the British government and one by Eulex. But the Eulex screening, I hate to say this, but was unprofessional, in that a number of unqualified people who weren't even lawyers in their own countries,
and they
became prosecutors in Kosovo, telling
professional, they weren't qualified.
Yeah.
Forget about experience. They were thrown in Kosovo to deal with the cases that poor Albanians and Serbs are thought that actually whenever you are Western, you're good. That's what their expectation was.
Shocking as it is, that is the truth. There was one Italian prosecutor working in Jaroslavas Novotna's office, dealing with high sensitive appeals. And he was not the rule was you had to be a prosecutor for 5 years in your own country, a qualified lawyer with 5 years experience exclusively prosecuting. And he was what we would refer to, he didn't have 5 years full-time experience. He was an honorary prosecutor in Italy, and that meant he would sometimes prosecute for the state, but on rare occasions. So he didn't fulfill the 5 years criteria, and he hadn't fulfilled the exams to be a full-time prosecutor in Italy. That was one. There was another number of other people who didn't have the full 5 years experience. And there was one who was never a prosecutor, she was never a lawyer, and she was never, she didn't even have a law degree. She was what we call in England a lay prosecutor, paralegal. But paralegals in the CPS are referred to as associate prosecutors. So she put the name associate prosecutor on her form and was accepted.
And she was responsible to decide for someone.
Not only was she responsible for decide for someone, she
For
was
their freedom
responsible. She was responsible for telling the local prosecutors how to conduct their cases.
How professional have you seen the local prosecutors?
I've seen
if
both.
you've seen them.
I've seen both. I've seen very professional, very good prosecutors, and I've seen others where the defendants were better than the lawyer. So,
one way or another, they were excluded from important cases. That am I allowed to say that due to the time that Eulex have?
Where I was working in SPRK, they dealt with some very, very serious cases, but then we had la creme de la creme there in Eulex. There were very good local prosecutors in Mitrovica where I worked there. And as you go, even with the defense lawyers, they were on the ball, they knew what they were doing for most part. Yes, you did get some of them that their clients were better than they were, but...
Knowing what you know about Eulex and the way they behaved and the way they kind of were sent there, promising the Kosovo people that we're sending someone to help to implement the rule of law. And knowing all these details from inside perspective, do you think there is ever a case that if there is a group of intellectuals and well-prepared individuals from Kosovo hiring the solicitors, do you think that there is a case there to take Eulex in European Union to court for misbehaving? Because based on the information, I consider that as totally inappropriate and kind of game.
They play games with the law. The rule of law doesn't apply to them. For example, a manufacturer of helicopters signs a contract, and the contract is signed by the head of Eulex for the helicopters, and that contract is broken. The poor man sues Eulex. They say, sorry, you can't sue Eulex. Eulex has no legal personality. Somebody else sues, okay, let's sue the council. The council's responsible for Eulex. Let's sue the council. They turn around and say, sorry, you can't sue the council. You don't have a contract with the council. Which is exactly the same problem I have had trying to sue Eulex.
You win the case, did you?
Not yet, no. I have not been able to sue them because the government of England does not recognize Eulex as an international organization. Now, you might find that very strange. I certainly do, because I've taken it all the way as far as I can. And it has been decided by the courts in England that I cannot sue Eulex because Eulex does not have legal personality. I could have sued the council, but if I'd sued the council, then they would have argued Sorry, Maria, you don't have a contract with the council, your contract's with Eulex. Do you see what I mean? So anybody trying to sue them,
So
they've created...
Eulex does not have a special immunity, but it have no way to keep them, to hold them accountable.
Yes. It's horrific.
I mean, whose idea was to invent this kind of organization, first of all?
I don't know.
Because
but this is how they protect themselves. This is how they do whatever they want, and no one can deal with it. And the fault lies with the member states. The member states have created this monster that is unaccountable.
I think the Parliament of Kosovo have voted pro-Eulex.
Yes.
If they were quite smart and study a bit more what Eulex means, they would never have voted this. Because it sounds
It's even
like...
worse than that. It is much worse than that. The law in Kosovo is, you cannot, if you are Albanian or if you're an international, you cannot sue Eulex in the Kosovo courts. It's prohibited.
And how about in the European court?
People try, but then you have the same game.
So again, they take you in circle to make sure that
Yeah.
you cannot sustain financially or morally to...
Yeah.
How bizarre. Let's kind of a bit of talks about a question about the Special Court of Justice. Again, it's a court that was voted pro by Kosovan government. Well, excuse me, by Kosovo Parliament. Considering how Eulex went and how the Eulex behaved, what are the chances the Special Court will have some decency and actually follow the cases through in a fair way and in a good manner?
I'd like to think on that, but once again, you're living in hope rather than looking at the reality, because the reality is this court has been created. Again, it is something unusual. There's no such...
Sui generis. Everything that has to do with Kosovo is called sui generis now.
Yeah, yeah. It's got like 1 foot in Brussels and 1 foot in Kosovo. It's been adopted in the constitution, but the way it's operating, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I've been away from Kosovo now 5 years. But as I understand it, they're only looking at Albanian war criminals. And they're not looking at Serbian war criminals. And I don't know of a single case that they've looked at that has involved a Serbian war criminal. And I don't think that's part of their mandate in any event. That's the first thing that will give me cause for concern. Then I know many Kosovan Albanians and Albanian translators have been rejected from working in the special court simply because the special court feel that
information would be leaked somehow.
Information will be leaked, precisely.
So how on earth are they going to translate the documents if they don't?
They've got Albanians from America who speak Albanian, or from Britain who speak Albanian. That's the way they're operating. But, like I said, when I was talking about the court of Mitrovica, the court has to reflect the people that it deals with. It has to reflect the community it's dealing with. Now, if you have a court that is not allowing Kosovans to participate in, but is prosecuting only Kosovans, and I've never heard of a court
It's so specific on
that is so
restrictions.
specific on restrictions. If you said, we're setting up a court to look at war crimes, fine. You look at Serbian war crimes, you look at war crimes committed by anybody within your territory, yeah? And if people are outside the territory, you get extradition orders, or you put pressure on the government to get those people brought before a court of law. So that creates difficulty number one, which dashes one's hopes for a fair process, because not only has the legal system got to be fair, it has to be perceived to be fair. And currently there is a perception that this court is discriminatory because it's only looking at Albanian war crimes. If they had set up a court like the ICTY that was looking at both sides, as looking at war crimes generally, fine, but they haven't. So that's number one that gives me cause for concern. Number two that gives me cause for concern is that many of the individuals who have been involved in some of the cases that I have mentioned earlier in this conversation are now working in the special court. Did you know Francesco Flore applied to work in the special court? I mean, he was rejected, but he did apply.
Did apply, did have that strong to apply.
Yeah.
I think I got a couple of names say that. That was quite interesting to mention, if I can find them. Out of Minister Court. Who is Ekaterina Trandafilova? Is anyone that rings a bell?
No.
Fidelma Donlon. No?
Fidelma.
Yeah. I found those two names. They came present the court in Kosovo as the head of the court, I think, or special court. They are underlined. I just took them with me, thought that maybe they are kind of someone who were previously in Kosovo, some kind of mission, and you may know about it. But yeah, the information the International Court of Justice is going to get from Unmik, Eulex, an individual, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hope, for the sake of justice, that this court does a good job for Kosovo. I really do. But I don't see...
The way it's set up,
Yeah.
it does not sound right.
No. And not only that...
It's based on Dick Marty's
Yes.
report.
It's not based on his report. It is the team that set it up had been investigating the allegations in the Dick Marty report, and in, is it Carla Ponte's?
Carlo Del Ponte book.
Yeah. And I think they investigated it and they found insufficient evidence, but they found evidence of other crimes and felt that setting up a special court would be a good idea. Personally, I think it was jobs for the boys. Our jobs have ended. How can we extend our position here? But that's just a suspicion. But let's look at what they're doing. Unmik investigated war crimes.
Eulex.
And Eulex investigated war crimes. So what are they going to do differently?
Hage, the court in Hage have done it international. We've got Ramos Haredina, we've got Fatmir Lima, we've got a few others that they've been freed, lack of evidence. We have in another court.
What exactly is this court going to do differently to what Unmik and Eulex did? What they say is, we're going to do it differently because we are going to have strict confidentiality and things are not going to leak out and witnesses are not going to be endangered. We had witness protection within Unmik. There was witness protection within Eulex. And the problem we had with the witness protection was that the European countries were not prepared to take our witnesses into their countries and incur the costs of looking after them. And you know what happened to witness X in one of Maurizio's cases, in the Klitschko case. He committed suicide. And I know of other cases within the remit of the special court where they have witnesses, and everybody knows who are witnesses in Kosovo anyway, because it's so small and there's so much
going on
in and out. And they've been threatened, their family have been threatened, and they've had absolutely no support from the special court whatsoever. They're still in their positions wherever it is in Kosovo. I'm not going to endanger them, but they're still there with absolutely no help and support. So I don't know what this special court is going to do to protect witnesses, or what this special court is going to do so differently to Unmik and Eulex.
Court should do.
Yeah, I honestly don't. If I'm mistaken, I'm sure I will soon discover it. I hope for the sake of the people of Kosovo it's administered fairly, but I don't feel confident that it is.
Let me just take you through to the people of Kosovo and the way we grown up. Well, I left Kosovo in 1992. But we got Kosovo, we're talking about Kosovo, but mainly Albanians in Kosovo. We were under repression during the Serbian time and Yugoslavian time, just after the Second World War, until 1985, until Serbia took over Kosovo. We then got the vicious war that, apart from massacres and crimes, there was a cleansing took place, that whole Kosovo got set in fire and moved out. Then we got Unmik, brought people back promising, with a K4, promising them the peace and stability. Then Unmik showed unprofessional and could not handle the cases, so they have passed into Eulex.
No, I don't think that's true.
Now, European Union, well, I'm trying to see from perspective of one Kosovan, whether it's Serb or Albanian. Now, we got Eulex, for example, an organization that shows to be completely unorganized and, in fact, not fit for purpose for what they promised, where the people of Kosovo expected to have justice done and actually have a steady and stable life. Then we have International Court, special for Kosovo. How long more these poor people have to kind of live with a hope and having constantly bringing a new organization to actually direct them and redirect them?
I think there comes a time where you have to deal with things yourself and set your own government and create your own institutions and make them effective. Unfortunately, the political turmoil, shall I say, has prevented progress in that area, and where people are fighting amongst themselves, internationals can walk in and say,
get what they want and leave what they don't need.
yeah.
Is it fair to say? It's kind of, I mean, I hope that people of Kosovo and people in the whole world understand that if you don't resolve your own issues within your own means, whoever comes will not resolve it for you.
Well, they can't. I'm sorry, but they can't. They can form assistance by enabling people to meet and negotiate, say, between Kosovo and Serbia. They can form protection to prevent further incursions into Kosovo or vice versa. Not that it's vice versa, but yeah.
Understanding that.
And they can create an interim normality by enabling schools and all essential services and things to operate. But at the end of the day, people will get frustrated because, one, there's a lot of poverty, but people will be frustrated because they're not determining their own futures. And
so they live from day to day, but not with a long-term hope.
yeah, I mean, at the moment, you've still got Eulex there. You've got an independent government which is functioning, but it seems to be
Quite
unstable. And the worst thing that could happen for Kosovo now is instability. And what you need is a stable government who can turn around and say, we're not subordinate to you, Eulex or Unmik. We are our own country, and these are our needs. And
put their priorities forward.
Yeah, put their priorities forward. But that has never happened. It hasn't happened in the 7 years I've been there.
Well, it didn't happen until now. We have just a government kind of wobbling, which is politics, and I wouldn't like to get into politics so much, considering that
politics,
I respect the fact that you are...
where there is a political vacuum, these things happen.
The crimes uses that space totally.
Absolutely, yeah.
Ms. Bamieh, is anything else that you want to add to the interview before I kind of say thanks?
I don't know. I've answered hopefully all your questions to the best of my ability. I don't know if there's anything I've left out that...
Raising the question about the Special Court of Justice that was invented recently, do you think there is a case or there is a way to revoke that special court completely, to invalidate?
I think you've made an agreement to set up the special court. It is now part of the Constitution of Kosovo, and if such, and it's open to any country to revoke any agreement that it is entered into. Obviously, the Constitution would be amended, but these things cannot be done without thinking through the consequences. And the consequences of such action would be political consequences, which I'm not qualified to speak on, but it's something that Kosovo has to think of very, very carefully. There are grounds for saying that the way this court is set up is discriminatory, and because it's discriminatory, I will not get a right to a fair trial, and therefore the whole process is contrary to the Human Rights Act. But those are tenuous legal arguments, whereas the people of Kosovo have got to decide what they want and what they can do without negative
impact.
Yeah, without negative impact.
Do you think, even if they have a resistance to revoke it as it is, do you think Kosovo intellectuals should come together and challenge the way it's run?
Oh, absolutely.
So instead of revoking, challenge it and bring it to the line that the Kosovo and international community should agree to some kind of common ground to make it as professional, as transparent as possible can be.
Absolutely. I think that is one solution to the difficulty. And transparency is important, but fair process is important too. But how are you going to, even if you do change the court and the way it operates from within, which is an excellent way forward, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done, how do you deal with the perceptions of the people who are being investigated by this court, who feel that they're being investigated because they are Albanian?
Well, I think that's another case to be dealt with if ever is going to be raised a commission to kind of see things the way they went, step by step. And I hope one day we see a group of intellectuals in cooperation with internationals. And why not to take advisors
Absolutely.
like you that have a great experience of how they dealt with during the Unmik and Eulex, which is...
Yeah, I think also it's not just fair play for in relation to these cases. I know of cases which were sent to Serbia, why I know not, to be investigated there, and they've never been investigated. So if a commission's going to look at all of this, it's also going to have to look at all the cases that were sent to Serbia to be dealt with, which haven't been dealt with. It was also going to have to look at rape as war crimes, because of a lot of women didn't want their cases going to Serbia to be dealt with, and don't feel comfortable talking about their experiences to a Serbian prosecutor about what happened to them. So the whole thing is a bit of a mess, and it all has to be looked at in the round as to what is actually going on with different aspects of the war, because you have to look at the war crimes being investigated in Serbia, and why they're not being investigated by this special court, the effect of the victims of rape as war crimes, and you also have to look into the missing persons, and I'm not just talking about Albanian missing persons. There's a lot of Serbian
missing people
on both sides, because everybody wants to live in peace in the future.
And the only way to do it is by knowing,
to clear this and deal with it, so the process of reconciliation can begin and people can move forward with their lives and concentrate on the economic goals and challenges that are lying for both communities.
Mrs. Bamieh, thank you so much for having the time for us.
That's okay.
and explaining to us thoroughly where we are and where we're going to, as I'm talking on behalf of
don't know.
Kosovans and Albanians.
Yeah.
It was great to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I've contributed something useful. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
Teleshikues të ALBUK TV, ishte Maria Bamieh, e cila na sqaroi shumë për lëvizjet në Kosovë, gjykatat në Kosovë, drejtësia në Kosovë përmes Unmikut, Eulexit, edhe tani që ka pritum nga Gjykata Speciale. Miru pafshëm, natën e mirë.